Good evening, everyone. At the Friss Center, our installation of World War I and American art opens with Gassed, the monumental canvas completed in 1919 by John Singer Sargent in fulfillment of his service as a war artist for the British government. In the century since it was painted, Gassed has traveled from its home, the Imperial War Museum in London, just once before, nearly 20 years ago in 1999, when it went to Boston and Washington, D.C. for a Sargent retrospective. The extraordinary size of the picture ensures that it rarely leaves London. That the Imperial War Museum has allowed it to be part of this show speaks volumes about the scholarly significance of World War I and American art, and the exhibition's organizing curators, Robert Cozzolino, Ann Knutson, and David Lubin, are to be congratulated. The Imperial War Museum has also enriched this exhibition with 5 exquisite watercolors that Sargent painted while on the Western Front in the summer of 1918. To celebrate these rare and generous loans, my colleagues and I at the Friss Center thought it would be ideal to have Richard Ormond, the leading expert on John Singer Sargent, to deliver a lecture about them on opening day. We are grateful that he accepted our invitation, especially since, like the Imperial War Museum Sargent pictures, he came all the way from London. Mr. Ormond's distinguished career includes formerly serving as Deputy Director of the National Portrait Gallery in London and Director of the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, England. He is a co-author of the 9-volume catalog raisonné of Sargent's oils and watercolors, a project to which he dedicated more than 3 decades of intensive research and writing. The final volume was published just last year, and its penultimate chapter is entitled War 1918. In extraordinarily eloquent prose, it examines Sargent's wartime experience that culminated in his masterpiece, Gassed. Mr. Ormond is a co-curator of the exhibition Sargent the Watercolors, now on view at the Dulwich Picture Gallery in England. It is one of many critically important exhibitions on Sargent that Mr. Ormond has organized since his first at the Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery in 1964. His 2006 exhibition, Sargent's Venice, is simultaneously my favorite on Sargent and on Venice. It is worth noting, too, that Mr. Ormond was a co-curator of the 1999 Sargent retrospective that last brought Gassed to America. To Mr. Ormond, Sargent is not simply an endlessly fascinating subject, he is also family. Mr. Ormond's grandmother was Sargent's youngest sister, Violet, whose home was filled with the artist's paintings and drawings. Mr. Ormond's lifelong exposure to the master's work gives him insights that no one else possesses. He, more than anyone else, is responsible for the rich and nuanced understanding we now have of who Sargent was as both a person and a painter. For all these reasons, I am pleased to invite Mr. Ormond to the podium to deliver his lecture, Mr. Sargent Goes to War. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction. I'm thrilled to be here at the Friss. I think it's marvelous to see the exhibition, and I'm thoroughly enjoying Nashville, and everybody's been so kind to me. So many thanks to Susan and her colleagues. I'm going to rattle through the early life of Sargent. I'm sure a lot of you know it all backwards, but just before I get to the war, I thought I'd remind you of a few facts and figures as we go along. So Sargent's born in Florence in 1856 to expatriate American parents. Dr. Sargent was a promising surgeon. Mrs. Sargent was loved travel, she loved Europe, and they came to get over the death of a firstborn, and in the words of one biographer, they forgot to go home. And so Sargent lived a kind of gypsy life, they were never anywhere long enough to have their own furniture or their own house. They went down south for the winter, to Nice or Rome or Florence, and then back up to the cities of Europe, to the Alps or the Pyrenees in the summer, a sort of expatriate circuit, if you like. And Sargent was born in Florence in 1856. He had very little formal education, most of it provided by his father, but he did speak 4 languages. He'd seen most of the great sights of Europe. His mother, who was a keen watercolorist, and she insisted on her children sketching, and she always said that if they began a sketch, they had to finish it. So she was quite a martinet in that way. He had 2 surviving sisters. Emily on the left was a year younger than Sargent, seen here in a charming early sketch by Sargent, and again another biographer described her as the wife whom Sargent never had. They neither of them married. They were very close together, both very musical. Emily is a marvelous watercolorist. I'd love somebody to do a show of her watercolors sometime, and very intelligent. Sharp, too. She didn't suffer fools gladly. On the right, Violet, 14 years younger than her brother, the baby of the family, and she's my grandmother, seen here in a rather splendid impressionist sketch out of doors by the river. She posed for him quite a lot as a young woman. She married a Swiss, and they were inveterate travellers, so nothing really much changed. The children were born in various exotic places. So that's the family. The Sargent parents have to reluctantly come to the conclusion that their son is, the one thing he really wants to do is to paint and be an artist. And so they think, well, if that's the case, we better get him trained as well as possible. So off he goes to Paris, because that's where you got trained, in the studio of Carolus Duran, a fashionable French portrait painter. But it's also important to remember that Sargent studied drawing in the École des Beaux-Arts, so he was both doing this rigorous training in drawing as well as painting in Carolus Duran's studio. And Carolus Duran taught his pupils to paint from the very word go, and to paint, well, the French lovely word, au premier coup, with the first stroke, and no sort of fudging away. You had to describe a tone or a half-tone, and Sargent took to this absolutely as a duck to water, and it's this facility with paint, right from the word, the mastery of the medium, that underlies everything he did. And you see it in this marvellous portrait of his master, a sort of sign-off. Here's the young Sargent, as it were, acknowledging his debt to his master, a most original portrait of capturing the personality of this rather dandified artist, very much a favourite of the salon, and you see that little touch of purple in his lapel, which is the Légion d'honneur. So he may look rather bohemian, but he's quite establishment. But he's also a friend of Manet, and there are all those categories of impressionist and academic don't always terribly work. Sargent makes a great impact at the Salon, both with his portraits and with his subject paintings, that wonderful great painting of El Jaleo, the flamenco dancer in the Isabel Stewart Gardner Museum. And then all goes sickeningly wrong with the portrait on the right, the famous portrait of Madame Gautreau, which he plans as a masterpiece. It's not a commission, it's a picture that he asked to paint, he's fascinated by this peacock-like woman, particularly the profile, and he takes 18 months to paint her. Goes to her country house. He's always complaining about how lazy she is and how difficult she is as a sitter. She's not French, she's from Louisiana. She's a fellow American expatriate, which is an important point. She'd come to Paris because the plantation was doing very badly, and with her sister, and they both marry quite well, and Madame Gautreau marries a French banker. Anyway, Sargent plans this as a chef d'oeuvre. It's a wonderful portrait, as you all know, this amazing woman with her white skin, this sheath-like dress, the décolletage, the outstretched, that very Sargent twisted arm coming down. I mean, so we think of it as absolutely the sort of quintessence of Parisian chic, but it absolutely got up the noses of the Parisian public. So difficult to understand why, and it became a scandal at the Salon. Poor Sargent, rather with his tail between his legs, comes over to England and eventually settles in London. But of course it's a bit out of the frying pan into the fire, because the English are even more conservative than the French. Anyway, he's painting wonderful impressionist pictures, because he's not got many commissions. He's got lots of time on his hands. He's out at a wonderful village, Cotswold village in England, a whole group of interesting, lively artists, Anglo-American artists and writers congregate of a summer, and he paints this wonderful picture, Carnation, Lily, Lily, Rose, a sort of jumbo sketch, all painted out of doors over 2 successive seasons. The daughters of an artist friend, the Barnard sisters, and if I can interject a little autobiographical, I did know one of the little girls, Dorothy, who was my brother's godmother, so in extreme old age, still living in Broadway. Anyway, this is the sort of ultimate garden picture, and it did score some success at the Royal Academy. The English love little girls in white, and they were able to overlook the freedom of the painting. It's wonderfully free, in spite of the fact it was painted over such a long period of time. It's garden pictures, incredibly difficult to paint gardens with any success. I always think this is the sort of ultimate in garden painting, garden pictures. And the breakthrough for him as a portrait painter comes in 1887, when he's asked to paint Mrs. Marquand. He comes over to America. He's greeted as a prodigal son, a returning hero. He's showered with commissions, amongst them the wonderful portrait of Isabel Stewart Gardner, that extraordinary woman who built Fenway Court, the fantastical Venetian palazzo, and posed rather, I think, as in emulation of Madame Gautreau in a black dress again, against this amazing Italian piece of fabric. And it was much criticized at the time because Mrs. Gardner's was rather, she liked shocking conventional Boston society. So her husband said, "I'm never going to lend that picture again." Anyway, and on the right, Sargent comes into his own in England in the 1890s, and he's recognized then. His rather flamboyant French style is suddenly meets the spirit of the age, and he becomes the great Anglo-American portrait painter. This wonderful portrait of Mrs. Karl Mayr, the wife of a diamond a merchant. I just love it. It's the sort of quintessence of Sargent. It's all seen in the most extraordinary way. The foreshortening that forces the great dress to come billowing out, and she's there with her children behind this great frothy, and she's so full of life, Mrs. Karl Mayr. And somebody said to me recently, "Oh no, she's not." Said, it's not a motherly gesture to her children. It's back, children, back. Anyway, and he's also commissioned in 1890 on a second visit to the States. He's commissioned to paint the great scheme of murals in the Boston Public Library on the theme of religion. It's his Sistine Chapel. He designs all the enrichments, all the architectural enrichments. It's been recently restored and relit. It's absolutely glorious. And Sargent had to retrain himself as a mural painter, of course, he's drawing on his experience in the École des Beaux-Arts of composing on a grand scale. His style of painting is very fluid. Paint surfaces are not appropriate to, he needs a much flatter style. He goes back to school in life drawing. All of the figures were all carefully studied in charcoal drawings. And it's rather breathtaking, I think, as a whole scheme. And he later went on to do the Boston Museum of Fine Arts with a great classical scheme. And this, in his view, this was his greatest contribution to the art of his time. And eventually, when he gives up portrait painting, it is in order to complete the murals and also to paint landscapes. He reaches a certain point in his life and thinks, what am I going to do for the next 15 years or 20 years? And he says, well, I don't want the pressures of portrait painting. I want more freedom and I want to finish the murals. And around 1900, the pressures are so great, he feels the need to get away every summer and autumn. He goes to the Alps very often, first off in August, then down to Venice, his love affair with Venice, and then to some more exotic clime. And he's often painting in watercolour. I think they're very modern, these watercolours, and you will see some more when he gets to the front. Again, in watercolour, he's just as fluid as he is in oil. And what he can achieve, the effects he can achieve. And I always feel he's challenging himself. He never takes the easy line. He doesn't follow easy formulas or easy popular subjects. He's always, and he crops, he condenses, he uses all sorts of media. He's fascinated with pattern. You see here the gourds. I mean, goodness, it's what, you know, where are we? We're completely ungrounded. We're presumably looking up at this trellis with the light coming through, almost abstract and so exciting. And that's what I think. Sargent is a real modernist in the way that he composes, and he's got the fluidity to create amazing effects of light. And the little sketch just of a mountain fire sweeping across, all done. Just, I mean, the fire there's hardly any flames at all there. It's just the smoke tumbling down. And then goes to Palestine in 1905 to mug up on the murals and spends time with the Bedouin in the desert and does some wonderful watercolors. Wonderful confrontation. You wonder what Sargent made of the Bedouin and what the Bedouin in Earth made of Sargent. We now reach the war, you'll be glad to hear, after all that time. He was in the Tyrol in 1914, and the war broke out, and he was trapped there with his companions. He had various artist friends. With his family, he liked to spend time with his sisters and nephews and nieces in the Alps, but after that he would go travelling with his sister Emily and with other artist friends. Anyway, they're trapped in the Tyrol, and it takes quite a long time before Sargent can extricate himself, although America is, of course, a neutral country. His English companions get away much more quickly. And already, I think, in the Tyrol, he's haunted by the war, the impending, this sort of folly of mankind. And he's painting all sorts of crucifixes, religious subjects. And here on the left is a picture of a simple chapel in one of the valleys of the Tyrol, which, of course, then were Austrian, and later became Italian, but at this time, this is Austria, and there's a monk hearing a confession of a woman underneath the crucifix, and on the left there's a Madonna you can just see with her, she's got the sword, she's the Madonna of the Sorrows, and on the left, this is at Colfush, now Colfosco, a woodcarver is carving a crucifix with a much older one on the wall behind, I followed Sargent all over the world, and I've been there, and I met his niece back in the 1960s, who may have been one of those the little children peeking through there. And then this haunting watercolour in the British Museum, which is part of an exhibition of British watercolours at the present time, of these memorial crosses in a cemetery in Colfosco, up one of the Tyrol. He comes back to London, and he paints. He gives up painting oil portraits, which horrifies people. Mr. Sargent, you've always painted us. Oh, I'll paint your gates, your fences, whatever you like, but not the human face. Anyway, as a substitute for oil portraits, he took up these charcoals, these portrait charcoals, 24 by 18 inches, which he could do in a single sitting. And that's my current project. So if any of you come across portrait charcoals, please to let me know, because there's 650 of them, and it's a devil of a business to track them down, and they are all over the place. So any help gratefully received. He did a number of soldiers at this time, and there are haunting stories. The man on the left was a man called Balfour, who was the second in command of a regiment, and they said to him, "You can't go to France, you're too old." And then the colonel fell ill, and Balfour said, "Well, they'll follow me, I must take the men." So of course he goes, and he's killed very soon afterwards. And then you realize too, because talking to his granddaughter, she said that the two of the boys went off the rails, became alcoholics, and you realize that the ramifications of the war were not just the death of the father, but the consequences for the family. On the right is Edward Wyndham Tennant, a member of a very prominent family. His aunt was the wife of Prime Minister Asquith, and he was a sort of gilded youth, was killed on the Somme in 1915, aged 19, and his death caught the imagination of the nation. He seemed to stand for all these brilliant young men of that generation who were kind of decimated. Sargent is also at this time working on his murals, and in fact he comes to America in 1916 to install another lot of murals. This is one of the lunettes. It's Israel and the law, and the scroll with the law on it, and this shrouded, godlike figure. Wonderful composition. So he comes to America and really to work on the murals. He also spends time away, as he had done in Europe. He needs to get away in the summer. He goes to the Rockies in 1916, and this is Sargent doing the American Sublime. This is Lake O'Hara not in fact in America, it's the Canadian Rockies, and it's a wonderful, stupendous picture. I went up there and I was wondering where on earth this picture was painted from, and I came on a little plaque that said Sargent Point, and there was it was a bit disappointing. In fact, there was another occasion, my wife was here, we were going up to Twin Falls, another great picture. This is in the fog, another great picture Mrs. Gardner got hold of, and we arrived after trekking for hours, and we arrived there, and there was this little hut serving coffee, and my wife said, "Oh, I think I'd like a cup of coffee," and so I said, no, we've just trekked in, this is a simple life, not time for cappuccinos, but anyway, she went in, and there was this old lady, and Leonie explained what we wanted. She said, "Oh, you want to know where Mr. Sargent painted? Bill," she said to another old-timer, "take him up to Mr. Sargent's place." And so the memory of Mr. Sargent was still alive and kicking. Anyway, this is a stupendous picture in the fog. And then later, in 1917, he went to Florida and painted some gorgeous pictures. Vizcaya, if any of you have been to Vizcaya, near Miami, built by James Deering of International Harvester, the great Chicago company, built this amazing Italian villa, and it was just the kind of place that Sargent loved to paint a whole lot of watercolors there on the right, and there you see some black workers swimming. They were the workers who came from Cuba who helped to build Vizcaya. And then he also was fascinated by palms, the pattern of palms, and the light, the filtering of light. But again, rather like the goods, it's a flat surface almost, and so fluid. And when you get up close, you think, oh, I'll look more in detail. It just evaporates. It's just so economical and so filled with light and colour. It's really stunning. And he did a whole series of these. He's quite obsessive sometimes. And then in 1918, Sargent goes to war. He's asked to undertake a major work for what was going to be a Hall of Remembrance. The Prime Minister of the day, Lloyd George, wrote to him personally to say, please, Mr. Sargent, please will you go to France? Because Sargent was rather reluctant. He didn't feel he was a natural war painter. But anyway, off he sets, and he goes with the man top left, Henry Tonks, who was a famous teacher at the Slade School of Art, and had been a surgeon. And in fact, Tonks, before they go, had done a whole lot of watercolors of plastic. There was very advanced plastic surgery going on because of the war and these terrible wounds, and he did these sort of before and after watercolors of war victims. He was also rather a good caricaturist, and there he is painting Mr. Sargent, the burly Mr. Sargent, who of course was a compulsive smoker, and he's got a great cigar. And there he is at work under his umbrella. And so they go off to war, and Sargent is searching for a subject. He's also doing some wonderful watercolors, several of which are in this exhibition, like the wrecked sugar refinery. Isn't it glorious? I mean, he's so got it all, this collapsed, all the feeling for the metallic surfaces of these, the tinny surfaces, and the feeling for the shapes of these, and all collapsed in on each other. So extraordinarily bold and free, and just, that's it. Sargent goes for the motif. Whatever he's painting, he wants to get to the essence of it. He was also rather like that musically. I have an uncle who was his nephew, who was an organist, and he said Sargent's playing of the piano was rather like his painting. He would muff some of the notes, but he would get to the heart of the piece, and that's what you feel with Sargent, who takes sometimes the most unprepossessing subject. I mean, who would ever dream of painting that? And somehow electrifies it. And here's a quotation or two from him at this time. I have done a few sketches, but only of picturesque scenes of houses. It is very hard to do anything really significant of warfare. As he said, the further you get to the front, the less there is to paint. I am now in a tower comfortably lodged in a big empty house without a whole pane of glass in any window, shaken to its foundations night and day by guns going off within a few yards, the air full of whistlings and whinings and hummings, but on the whole pleasanter than the mud of the trenches, he says. And he won the hearts of other soldiers by his intrepid courage, and also he messed in with them and suffered the same hardships. Indeed, there's a picture of a wonderful one of an interior of a tent, and he fell ill with influenza at one stage. And here's some more of those marvellous watercolours. On the left, a wrecked mill at Arras. Isn't it great? He loves the structure of things, and he's captured in some detail the actual mechanics of this mill, the round shapes, and then the structure of the girders and pillars. And Sargent's a master of white. White's his colour. And look at what he does with that tarpaulin, with the water, pools of water dragging it down, and the shimmering feeling of light bouncing off it. There are all sorts of yellows, blue for the shadows. And so tour de force, rather like he was painting all those great dresses of the women. He loved what he could do with white. Or this scene of a gateway and wall, such as he would have painted in peacetime, and like a great wound, he shows the wall where some shell has gone in with a wrecked coach, a sort of shattered symbol of a peaceful life early on. The soldiers leaning against it. Again, a sort of an oblique view, always. Sargent never does the obvious. In Venice, you're always following him through the narrow. He doesn't do the big set pieces. It's often the angles are odd. He's very influenced by photography. He takes photographs himself, and the way that photographers crop and organize I think was very influential on him in the way he composes watercolors. And actually the soldiers themselves, you can see that there is an element, of course, and I was struck this time by looking at the Sargent in the exhibition by how distilled his vision of the war is. They're surrounded by much more violent images, and somehow his are rather distilled. It's very understated, his feeling for the war. But he has a natural, I think, affinity with the soldiers who are suffering there, two of them slumped out. But you can see, if you compare it with the photograph, he is somewhat idealizing the soldiers. And there, thou shalt not steal, of course, it was forbidden for the soldiers really to raid the local people because you didn't want to antagonize the local. But there they are doing what boys always do, snitching the fruit. And this rather beautiful painting of the interior of the cathedral at Arras, a neoclassical building, and Sargent loved neoclassicals. Architecture he loved its pillars and pilasters and arching spaces, and here the sunlight glowing in, and there the shattered orchestration of this heaps of rubble, the headless statue. And somebody described it as the spirit of beauty in destruction, and another critic called it a romantic meditation on classical ruins. The subject that the War Commission, and they were very active, they were sending lots of artists out to the front, but the one that Sargent was asked to do was not a documentary subject, not a sort of an immediate documentary subject, but something that would be a reflective work on the heroism and sacrifice of war. And it was intended for a hall of remembrance with 2 or 3 other big pictures that were going to encapsulate a more set-back view of what war meant. And, of course, it was never built. And Sargent's picture was going to be the centerpiece, and they wanted him to do a picture that would show, because he was American, that would show the Allies, the Americans and British, collaborating in some way, bringing the two armies together. And Sargent did begin exploring the possibility of doing such a subject. And you can see here one of the ideas he had of the Americans full of vigor marching up to the front, and the bedraggled British retreating, and here a whole lot of army lorries and this processional people on horseback. So this was, he called it the road, and he explored it quite a bit further in, there's another study for it, wonderful great gun there with a tractor and the troops going up, and you can see some of the studies for the motorcyclist and so forth, and for that great tractor up there pulling a gun. Sargent, he didn't want to paint that eventually. He'd seen at somewhere called La Barque du Sud, near Blairville, not far from Arras. He was with the British troops. He'd seen a scene of men blinded by mustard gas coming into a dressing station. And the sight of these men had moved him deeply. And he told the War Commission that really I don't want to paint the road. I don't want to paint that subject. I want to paint this subject of Gast. And so it was quite a sort of a head-to-head. And Sargent finally said, well, look, I will paint the road, but I'll only do it 5 feet across. If you want the 20-footer, it's got to be Gast. And so the commission eventually conceded this, and so Sargent was able to paint Gast. And this is a study for the picture. So this is kind of first idea for what he was going to paint, and of course it then gets elaborated. And I'm showing it beside a picture by Augustus John. He was another of the artists who was going to paint a scene of the Allies collaborating. This is one of Canadians. I don't think this was actually this was commissioned by the Canadians, but of course John, being John, never finished it. But it's a good point of comparison. So this again is a more considered piece, as compared with the picture here on the study of Nevinson, Charles Nevinson, called Paths of Glory, the kind of ghastly reality of the war, with these soldiers shot down before the ubiquitous wire. And there is Gast. Sargent was no stranger to processional pictures. He painted them throughout his career, intervals, and I'm just showing that lovely picture of Kashmir, which is one of his nieces, posed for all 7 figures, and they move in stately fashion, as if they're going to some shrine or whatever. I wonder, 7, are they the wise or foolish virgins, but it has that sort of wrapped in this cashmere shawl and moving in sequence across. And in the same way that we know it was the same model, I have a feeling, or a friend suggested to me, that actually with Gast, it's almost like a series of stills from a film, that it's the same figure moving in across. And it's a sort of classical frieze. It's very formal, very idealized, of this frieze of men moving across this golden landscape. And all kinds of layers of suffering, these suffering men in the foreground, like a sort of vision of hell, and another groups of men. And then in the background, you see the tents, this golden evening. Some of the troops are playing football. You notice too that up there, what you might have taken for being birds are actually planes fighting in the up in the sky. And of course, the pathos of these men. Mustard gas, chemical warfare was one of the horrors of the First War. You could be blinded, you could actually die from the mustard gas if you got it very badly. And it did have long-term effects depending on how much you took in. And I think Sargent is reflecting on the sacrifice that these men have made in the cause of the war. I think it's a very, very moving picture, the way it's composed, the whole feeling of this illuminated sky. It's a spiritual picture. Sargent, some critics have felt that there's not enough emotion in Sargent. He doesn't reveal himself enough. He's so understated, that it's all visual, but there isn't real heart there. What's he really feeling? But I feel here he does, in his own way, capture the pathos and the horror of war. You see below, he was given a lot of photographs by the British War Commission to sort of, I think, stimulate ideas. He had the whole albums of photographs, including this one that is quite well known of men again. You can see how Sargent transforms the sort of the realism of the photograph into this magnificent composition. And yes, there are various things I think were in his mind. Bruegel's famous blind leading the blind. I also think the burghers of Calais, the great Rodin, if you remember, they were about to be executed because they'd revolted from the British crown, and Edward III was going to string them up, and his wife, Queen Philippa, pleaded for them successfully. Of course, Rodin is a great friend of Sargent, and Sargent helps to find him English patrons. I also feel, maybe mistakenly, that the guy ropes there may be a reminiscence of a picture that Sargent loved, which was the great crucifixion scene by Tintoretto in the Scuola San Rocco in Venice. It's just an idea that there may be some reminiscence of that, because the crucifix is being dragged up by the men down here, and the guy ropes. And of course, with the murals, Sargent is also designing processional pictures on a big scale. This is Heaven and Hell in the Boston Public Library. The blessed are rising up to heaven in a great sort of processional way, and then down below these tangled bodies, rather like the bodies of the men. So Sargent is well able. He's doing all this large-scale composition in Boston. He's well tuned to create convincingly a major picture like Gast. He's also, the war affects him quite directly. This is two of the murals. This is church, and this is the synagogue. Synagogue got him into terrible trouble with the Jewish population in Boston because they were outraged by the way that synagogue had been, as an old woman, with blindfolded, and it was no good Mr. Sargent saying, but look, this is I'm following medieval iconography. This is how synagogue is represented at Rheims Cathedral and other places. They felt that he had shown contempt, and so there was a terrible, terrible row, and the Jewish population said this must be taken down, this mural, but the trustees, rather like now that it's all statues and pictures are being removed, in the same way that there was a strong movement, but trustees held their nerve. Anyway, there has been a suggestion. There's a very good book, and that's Rosemarie, his niece, his favourite model, that she may have for church. And she was at that time tending wounded soldiers, blinded soldiers in Paris. And this has a rather look of a greatcoat, and there's Christ with the church, the figure representing the church, that it might possibly have been modelled by Rosemarie. And there she is in one of those dazzling, this is a detail from the book. Isn't it simply wonderful what Sargent can do with paint? These two nieces, dressed in Turkish costume, a sort of oriental fantasy in the Alps. And Sargent was devoted to her. There she is with her brilliant French art historian husband, Robert-André Michel. He's killed in 1914. Rosemarie is in a church on Good Friday 1918, and the long-range German shell falls on the church, and Rosemarie is killed. And they're buried in a beautiful tomb that's looked after by the commune at Soissons, just outside Soissons, on the hillside. And every year they visit the tomb, and I was there 100 years to the day after Robert fell, with the mayor and the veterans singing the Marseillaise. So, and I've always had a strong feeling. Rosemarie was somebody who taught more about others than herself. She was very beautiful, but obviously a rare and generous person. Sargent begins work on Gast. He does lots of sketches, obviously, in France, but the real work is done in his studio, his Fulham Avenue studio, where he's painted the murals. It's a big job. He does endless studies. These are charcoal studies of all kinds for all the different figures. So it's a really long process of working through to create Gast. And it appears at the Royal Academy. I'm sure I've gone on for much too long. It appears at the Royal Academy in 1919, and is greeted with enthusiasm by most people. I'm afraid to say that Virginia Woolf is rather hard on it, and so is E.M. Forster. But then there are the Bloomsbury people, and they had it in for Sargent, and I don't think that's that. But Sargent's great friend Vernon Lee said of it, "This composition is as majestically serene as some antique frieze, while for the emotions of the beholder, it is as terrible as a chapter from Tolstoy," which I think is a rather good description. Not content with painting a great picture of suffering soldiery, Sargent is also persuaded to paint this great picture of the First World War British generals. Somebody described it as a portrait of Jack Boots. They're all wearing the sort of a terrific great picture in the National Portrait Gallery. And it's rather awe-inspiring in its way. It's an idealized setting. Those two, you see the base of two enormous columns, and there they all are in their splendid uniforms. And it was planned, it was commissioned by a wealthy South African, Sir Abe Bailey, as one of three pictures: the First World War statesman on the left by Guthrie, and the First World War admirals by somebody called Cope below, whereas Cope and Guthrie present the thing as if there's some meeting going on. Sargent doesn't bother with that. It's a school photograph. They're just arrayed across. But it's, I think, still a very impressive, imposing, just because it's so full frontal. There's no kind of attempt to create a narrative. There they are, boom. And again, the picture took ages. As he said, he had to put salt on the tails of the generals. There on the left is Smuts, the South African. It was also the Commonwealth and countries, and another, the Earl of Ypres, and two drawings, compositional, and they're almost these sketches for almost all the generals. And that appeared to rather less acclaim than Gast at the Royal Academy of, I think it's 1922. And just to complete the war, these are the Sargent's two murals in the Widener Library at Harvard, celebrating the Harvard dead. First of all, on the right, the Harvard troops entering the war to be greeted by the French with the American eagle prominent, and then a French figure of liberty, and then the death and victory on the left, and there they are in the Widener Library. Sargent had, after this, only 3 years to live. He completed the Boston Public Library, and then he went on to do this great series of neoclassical murals in the Museum of Fine Arts. You go up the staircase, there are all the Sargents, and you enter the rotunda, which is here on the left. And there's the staircase with the ceiling panels as you go up. And he still found time occasionally to go and paint in the countryside. This is a charming oil portrait of his friend Dwight Blaney on Ironbound Island in Maine, still owned by the family. And one of the family, took me out to where this was painted. Oh yes, you want to go and see where Mr. Sargent painted. In fact, all round Ironbound I went on a wonderful visit. And here we are, Mr. Sargent, 1925, on the eve of departure to Boston to install the last of the Boston Museum murals. He doesn't wake up in the morning just as he would want it to have gone. He's 69 with Voltaire's Lettres philosophiques across his chest. He's very widely read. He's very cultured. He's very musical. And large man, 6 feet, portly, real Edwardian, difficult man to read biographically. He's very private. He doesn't wear his heart on his soul. All his energy and sensuality and vitality, you feel, pours into his art. And he's buried at Brookwood Cemetery outside London with his sisters. And thank you very much for listening.